September 12, 1990. It's an unseasonably warm evening in Otis Park, a small recreational center in the Nob Hill neighborhood of Colorado Springs. A meeting for the Women's Lupus Support Group is just getting started.
Sometimes we had about 40 people. Sometimes we had 5. It was a fun meeting, and we had refreshments, and we're socializing and that sort of thing.
One of the regular women in attendance is 32-year-old mother of 3, Diane Hood.
Thank you all for all your support.
She was a sweetheart. Pretty girl. Always, wanting to help set up programs and work with us.
Just 18 months earlier, soon after her 3rd child was born, Diane was diagnosed with lupus.
It's an autoimmune problem where your body immune system attacks certain organs.
So, who's gonna pick up Seth today?
It can be very devastating.
But Diane is a fighter, and it's not long before she's on the verge of remission.
Diane was feeling really, really good. I told her story.
I know you've noticed I'm a little bit better.
It was really a good meeting for her.
You look great. I'll see you next week.
At 8:30 p.m., the meeting lets up. Diane says goodbye and walks out with her friend, Karen Johnson.
They're in a city park, in a very quiet, crime-free part of town. The furthest thought from your mind is that right outside that door, death is waiting.
Sarah is about to head home when her night takes a horrifying turn. A dark figure bangs on the door.
What is going on?
It's Karen Johnson, and her hands are covered in blood.
Karen came flying back into the building. And she was just hysterical.
Look at me. I'm gonna call the police. Okay.
Karen's yelling, "Diane's been shot. Diane's been shot."
But Sarah has no time to process this information. As a registered nurse, instinct takes over, and she quickly moves into action.
I automatically ran out the door, never thinking that I could have been shot too, but it never even occurred to me. That's just automatic for a nurse. That's what you do.
Just outside, Sarah finds Diane lying in a pool of blood.
We turned her over on her back, and her eyes were open. She was gasping for breath, and as I started the compressions,
Hang on, Diane!
the blood came through my fingers.
Diane, listen to me!
So we did CPR and called paramedics.
Within minutes, EMTs arrive on the scene and take over for Sarah. But the situation is bleak.
She had 2 major gunshot wounds. One entered from the back on the shoulder and exited the front of the shoulder. The second round perforated the chest and came to rest in the second arm.
Diane is rushed to a nearby hospital, but it's too late. At 8:52 p.m., Diane Hood is pronounced dead.
It was just so hard to believe that that kind of thing could happen. It just didn't seem quite right.
The brutal death of this good-natured mother of 3 sends shockwaves throughout this normally peaceful part of town.
A shooting in that park was an extremely unusual event. In that neighborhood, things didn't happen like that.
Less than 30 minutes after the first shot was fired, homicide detective Lt.Joe Kenda arrives on the scene.
When I get there, there's a small blood stain in the parking lot. Some witnesses and a bunch of police officers. The initial report is that it's an armed robbery, so you begin at the beginning, as always. Tell me about this neighborhood. Are there armed robberies in this neighborhood? Are there parolees recently released from prison with a record for armed robbery? Nothing. No such crimes. No such events.
What do you got for me? Well, apparently the witness was with the victim.
Kenda turns to eyewitness Karen Johnson, still visibly shaken by the incident.
It took some deal of time to calm down Karen Johnson because, of course, she just witnessed this horrible event where a friend was killed. But once that occurred, she is our best and only witness to this crime. And that's really important.
Tell me exactly what you saw.
It happened so fast. We were walking to our car and
Karen recalls that she and Diane were on their way to the parking lot when they suddenly heard footsteps from behind.
One figure came from the east side of the building, dressed in dark clothing, wearing a ski mask and wearing camouflage pants, and accosted Diane Hood. Went for her purse. Diane turned towards the robber and said, "Here, take it," and let go of her purse.
According to Karen, Diane tried to run, but the man grabbed her arm and pulled out a large handgun.
He shoots her once, hits her high in the shoulder and knocks her down.
Diane begged for her life, but the man fired again, straight into her chest.
It was just a walk up, grab the purse, shoot her, and run off. Everything pointed to a robbery that had gone bad for whatever reason.
Kenda asks Karen to describe what the shooter looked like. But all she remembers is that he was slightly shorter than her.
Give me a call anytime.
No race, no exposed skin. Can't tell us white, Hispanic, black. Can't tell eye color. We have a physical description of a person who can't be identified. That's not a lot.
Kenda instructs his team to comb the surrounding area for trace evidence the shooter may have left behind.
A lot of times robbery suspects, they have two things. They have a plan to get away, or they're going to wing it. That means they really don't know exactly where they're going to go as they're leaving the scene.
Hoping his suspect may still be lurking in the area, Kenda enlists the help of his canine unit to get a scent on the shooter.
So that officer arrives, canine officer, and he works the area where the shooter was standing, and the dog locks on a scent. Off they go. The dog continues on his track for almost a mile, into the housing areas, through alleys. The dog gets to a garbage can behind a private residence, and the dog sits down.
Yes.
That's his alert system. There's something in this can.
Inside the garbage can, Kenda makes a crucial discovery.
An olive drab field jacket, pair of gloves, a black ski mask, and camouflage pants. These items match the description given by the witness at the scene.
Looks like we got the shooter's clothes here.
Once the clothing is removed, goes to the laboratory to process for trace evidence. They find brown human hair inside the ski mask. Ran a gunshot residue test on the gloves, and they tested positive. So this is our stuff worn by the shooter, no question. The dog continues the track from the trash can, comes to the curb line of a street, and stops. The dog is now confused and working in circles because where'd the scent go?
Hey, Lieutenant, we lost the scent.
Well, it went into a car, in our opinion. The scent disappears because the scent drives away.
Kenda's only promising lead has just hit a dead end, and so has his case.
We could have a lot of problems solving this because we don't have anywhere to go. You were looking into that black tunnel that there was no end to.
I don't have a suspect. Not really. I have a masked maniac. So where does that leave me? Out in the cold.
But as Kenda soon discovers, it's the victim herself that will provide the key to this investigation.
So here I am, looking for the masked man, the Lone Ranger, as it were. That's not going to be very useful. So let's get to what is useful. Diane Elaine Hood. Who is she? Tell me everything about Diane Elaine Hood. Everything. Because somewhere in her life, she encountered someone who wants her dead.
Mother of three, Diane Hood, has been shot and killed during an armed robbery gone horribly wrong. The canine unit helps Lt.Joe Kenda track down the clothes worn by the shooter, but not the shooter himself.
You're always hopeful that the dog will go up on somebody's porch and sit down. Not the case this time.
With no other substantial leads, Kenda and his team turn to an old-fashioned police technique: neighborhood canvassing.
Take the Ritz.
It was pretty much a tedious start south of the park and work our way north for a couple of blocks on either side and a couple of blocks east and west, knocking on every door, seeing who was home, seeing if they knew anything.
Just as the neighborhood search seems hopeless, detectives encounter a woman with some new information.
During our neighborhood follow-up, we reveal this guy named David Burns.
I can probably guarantee he had something to do with it.
What if he could have done this crime? He lives in the area. He has problems. He has issues. He has unresolved anger.
What's more, locals have given him another, more sinister nickname.
Homicidal Dave. Interesting, we happen to be in the homicide business. Who is this guy?
We had information that he wore the military-style camouflage pants and uniform, and since we had found that uniform in the neighborhood, that gave us something to look at.
He was a veteran of the first Gulf War. He often spoke loudly to no one walking around the neighborhood, using strings of profanity for no apparent reason. They saw him as dangerous, crazy, all those sorts of things.
Detectives follow up on the lead, but quickly learn the suspect known as Homicidal Dave has an airtight alibi.
But we know where Dave is the night of the murder.
Right here on it. You trying to shoot and pull. Absolutely.
He was with some friends and some other people, and we confirmed it. So he gets eliminated as a result.
We were at an area of the investigation. We really didn't have any direct leads to go on. But that's the next step, is then take what you have and expand it.
Expanding the investigation means revisiting all of the eyewitness testimony, starting with the primary witness, Karen Johnson. As he reads through Karen's description of how the killer shot Diane Hood, Kenda picks up on a telltale piece of evidence.
She says, and she's quite clear about this, he shot her in the shoulder, and then he walked up to her and shot her in the chest. That, in my mind, is critical information.
Kenda now believes that Diane Hood was intentionally targeted by her killer.
This is not an armed robbery. Someone wants to make it look like that, but it isn't that. It's an assassination.
But Kenda still doesn't know who murdered this innocent mother of three. So he turns to the forensic evidence for additional clues.
After Diane was pronounced dead at the hospital, her body was escorted to the El Paso County morgue. During the autopsy, 2 bullets are recovered from her body.
Kenda has the slugs rushed to the ballistics lab for a more detailed analysis.
Our ballistics man was one of the best in the country. He called me that same morning and he said, "Kenda, you are a lucky guy.
Right.
Because you're looking for a very rare and valuable gun. A Colt Peacemaker patent 1872 single-action Army revolver. It's a cowboy gun, the one you've all seen in the movies. That's the gun. The bullet says so." Wow. I love limiting factors, and that is a huge limiting factor.
The lab also informs Kenda that this rare gun is worth thousands of dollars and known to be sold at antique gun shows.
It could mean that the person responsible for this crime is a collector of guns.
The unique model of the murder weapon is a key detail, but that's all it is, a detail.
We have 2 interesting pieces of evidence, but I need a person.
Whenever you have a homicide investigation, you're going to do background on almost everybody involved, including the victim.
As Kenda and his team look into the life of Diane Hood, they find nothing that would raise any red flags.
Diane is the salt of the earth. She is a wonderful mother. She's a devoted housewife. But that's not leading me anywhere. We're still at the stage of trying to find a suspect.
Needing someone connected to the victim, Kenda turns to the victim's husband, Brian Hood, hoping he might provide some much-needed insight into this case.
He is grieving over the loss of his wife. He's trying to arrange a burial. His family is there. His kids are upset. We say, hey, we know it's a difficult time, but anything you can tell us could be helpful without you even realizing it.
Brian agrees to accompany Kenda to the station. Looking into his background, Brian's life appears to be as idyllic as his wife's.
Brian had been a college quarterback. Diane had been a college cheerleader, and that's how they met. This was an upstanding American family that everybody dreams about.
Beyond being a devoted husband and father, Brian Hood is extremely well-liked by his neighbors and business colleagues.
Brian was a very sociable person. I mean, easy to get to know, and he's a very good family man.
Anybody that saw Brian was impressed with his physique. He was a football player in college in Texas, probably 6'4", 220 pounds, all muscle.
It's Brian's physical stature that helps Kenda eliminate him as a suspect.
We know that our shooter is shorter than 5'9", so obviously, Brian is not the shooter.
As Kenda talks further with the victim's husband, he offers a seemingly minor detail that takes this case in a totally new direction.
How often go to the gym? I'd say I go about 4 or 5 times a week.
I'm kind of addicted to working out, and I go to a gym, and I go there almost every day. So we go to the gymnasium where he says he goes. We talk to 2 young girls at the desk.
Hey, ladies, doing today?
Good, how are you?
I'm in Colorado Springs Police Department. I need to ask you a couple questions.
We learned from these girls there's one particular client that Brian is very friendly with. They spend a lot of time talking to each other. And who is that? Well, it's this girl named Jennifer.
The girls at reception can't remember Jennifer's last name, but they do know she works at a nearby flower shop.
We're talking to the owner. He says, I do have that girl working here.
She's a great employee.
I know her, and I know her husband. They go to my church. What's her last name? Reale. Her husband's name is Benjamin. He's a captain in the Army at Fort Carson, and he's an intelligence officer.
The shop owner then provides some unexpected information about Benjamin Reale.
I like Ben, and he and I have a common interest.
We both have gun collections.
Gun collections.
Antique guns. We like to collect antique guns. Could Ben be our shooter? Could he have done this? Of course he could. So we need to look into this guy.
It's a solid lead, but Kenda also knows there are miles to go before this case can be solved.
Murder cases have one great similarity. You're always probing. You poke a murder case. You're poking around in the dark, because when you poke, you're waiting for something or someone to say ouch. And if it's ouch, well now, who might you be?
Young mother of 3, Diane Hood, has been brutally murdered outside her lupus support meeting in Otis Park. And Lt.Joe Kenda has just discovered his first viable suspect, Captain Benjamin Reale, an Army officer who collects antique guns, like the Colt 45 Peacemaker used in the fatal shooting.
If we can determine a person of interest that's connected to this, who somehow owns such a gun, wow, that would be good, wouldn't it? Yes, it would.
What's more, Ben's wife Jennifer is a known friend and workout partner of Brian Hood, the victim's husband. Now Kenda and his team wonder, could this innocent friendship have led Ben Reale to shoot Diane Hood?
That was a jump on our part, based on the fact that they're hanging out together, they're seen at the gym together. It could have been a jealous lover, it could have been somebody just mad at him, trying to do vindictive things towards his family. There could be some motive developed there.
Kenda looks into Ben's personal life and learns an interesting detail. Ben Reale works at Fort Carson as a criminal investigator for the U.S. Army. As a soldier, he would have expert knowledge in the business of killing, and as an investigator, he would know how to get away with it.
The reality is also that the clothing recovered were military clothing. Ben Reale was a captain in the military intelligence unit at Fort Carson, so there's a nexus there that could easily be his clothing.
Ben's records show he is approximately 5'9" and 160 pounds. A physical description similar to the one Karen Johnson gave of the shooter.
So off we go to Fort Carson. Ben's in his office working, doesn't know we're coming. We walk in, and he has a startled look on his face.
We're looking into the murder of Diane Hood. Can you tell us where you were that night?
You can see the wheels turning. What is going on here?
When Kenda informs Ben of the investigation, he immediately goes on the defensive.
I was working by myself.
But Ben has no witnesses to support his alibi.
We also want to find out what kind of firearms he may have or have access to see if they could be something that were used in murder.
Why don't you tell us about this gun collection, please?
Ben admits to owning several antique guns, including one very valuable piece.
My dad gave it to me. It's the best piece I have in my collection.
It's a Colt 45 Peacemaker.
It's a Colt single-action Army Peacemaker, patent 1872.
Ben owns the exact type of gun the ballistics team identified as the murder weapon.
Could this guy be the suspect? Could this be the weapon involved? Obviously, our first intent would be to lock down that weapon, get it analyzed.
Ben takes Kenda to where the weapon is stored.
Ben has a look of complete confusion on his face, as well as concern.
This is my gun.
He presents his gun wrapped in a red shop rag.
This is the one. Ooh.
There it is. Colt Peacemaker, single-action Army. Exactly what I'm looking for.
The only problem is, the gun reeks of cleaning fluid.
And we were not able to recover any fingerprints on the weapon. While you're hoping that smoking gun has all the evidence on it, it doesn't always work that way.
All right, we're going to take this to the lab and have a test fire.
In the meantime, he's not finished with Ben just yet.
Listen, we need to go to our office. I have some other things I want you to look at. And he turned white.
To bring Ben Reale up to do the interview here on our police headquarters unit puts him out of his element, puts him in our element. Put him on our turf, it's better for us.
Ben is taken downtown, while his Colt Peacemaker is sent to the lab for testing.
Tell him put it priority. I have a potential suspect in my possession. And the identity of that weapon is going to make the arrest or not.
Ben is seated in an interview room, where Kenda lays out the shooter's clothes for him to examine.
Look familiar to you?
No.
He takes a side glance for a half a second. He says, no, I don't recognize him. He didn't look at him. I said, Ben, I need your attention for a moment. You didn't even look at these. I not only expect you to look at them, I expect you to examine them. Because at a minimum, I'm going to call your commanding officer and end your military career overnight. Or at a maximum, I'm going to arrest you for murder. You want to try this again? And he starts to cry.
Ben admits that the shooter's military fatigues are in fact his. And he has already turned over an antique Colt revolver that matches the ballistics expert's description of the murder weapon.
These are your clothes. And these are the clothes we're using in the murder.
I think we're in it now. We're not just in the right ballpark. We're in the right two seats. And I was feeling pretty pleased.
His sights on a confession, Kenda presses Ben about the shooter's clothes.
Where did you last see this coat and those pants? Well, in my closet at my house. And when was that? Well, I haven't been living there for 3 weeks. But the last time I saw them, that's where they were.
We've been fighting.
Ben explains that he's recently been having marital issues with his wife.
Please, can you just...
We've been having problems, and I moved out 3 weeks ago. I've been staying on post.
I'm done talking.
Sensing there's more to his story, Kenda urges the anguished army captain to continue. What Ben says next startles everyone.
My wife brought the gun in today to my job.
Well, my wife brought a gun in here this morning. One of my guns, wrapped in a rag, and said she wanted me to keep it for her.
What do you have my gun for?
Just take it, don't ask questions.
You
Just take
mean
it.
don't ask questions?
I don't care what
A couple weeks ago, she wanted to shoot it. So I took her out to the range, and I bought a box of ammunition, and I showed her how to load it and how to unload it, and she fired it a number of times. So he goes from a person of interest to a key witness. He has a gun in his possession, given to him by his wife. It just fit for me right away. You think back to that witness. It wasn't important to me at the time, but now I'm thinking about it. What did he do with the purse after he took it? He put it over his arm. That fact blasted back into my head. He put it over his arm, like a woman would do.
Lt.Joe Kenda has just eliminated Ben Reale as a suspect and replaced him with a brand new one.
When he told me that his wife brought him a gun, my first thought was, we're not looking for a guy, we're looking for a woman.
It's been nearly 48 hours since the young mother of three, Diane Hood, was brutally murdered. And Lt.Joe Kenda's first suspect, Captain Benjamin Reale, has just revealed a key piece of information. His wife, Jennifer Reale, recently handed him a freshly cleaned Colt .45 revolver. Kenda has just eliminated one prime suspect for another.
We're not looking for a guy. We're looking for a woman wearing a ski mask. And maybe her name is Jennifer.
But what motive would Jennifer Reale have to murder Diane Hood? Kenda needs to find out more about his new prime suspect.
She's a graduate of the University of Washington. She has 2 children, both girls. She is well regarded by her friends. Very nice person.
On paper, the young mother does not fit the portrait of a cold-blooded killer.
Generally, it's a male on male or male on female, domestic violence. To have a female go out there and basically execute Diane Hood seems really unusual.
Jennifer Reale is brought down to the station.
I want to see my husband.
That's where I'm taking you right now.
Kenda has a hunch that the couple's rocky relationship may provoke Jennifer to tip her hand.
You just need to get your clothes on.
They go into a room.
What's going on?
I didn't do anything.
They're in there for 30, 40 minutes, yelling and screaming at each other.
What does that have to do with the gun?
I hate this marriage. I hate everything about us.
I don't know what they said to each other, and I don't care at this point. But I'm waiting for that phone to ring from the lab, and it's not ringing.
It's clear from their body language, Jennifer and Ben are not co-conspirators.
Station right now.
Ben is struggling with the possibility that his wife may be a murderer.
I didn't kill anybody, okay?
Just then, the phone rings.
This is Kenda.
It's the ballistics lab, calling with news about Ben Reale's gun.
Kenda, that's your gun. You sure? To the exclusion of all guns on the planet, it's the one who killed Diane Hood. Turned to 2 of my detectives, canceled her dinner plans. Told her she's under arrest for first-degree murder.
Reale, please put your hands behind your head. No.
We need you to calm down. Hey, sit down. Get out.
Ben tries to grab her away from him. He just reacts. We slam him in a chair, and I put my hands on his face.
Be smart about this.
And I said, Ben, you're not part of this yet. You need to think about taking care of your children, not going to jail.
As detectives escort Ben out of the room, he looks at his wife one last time, only to see she's been placed in handcuffs.
Jennifer.
Now it's time for Lieutenant Kenda to turn his attention from Benjamin Reale to Jennifer Reale.
During that conversation, she denies.
I didn't kill anybody.
She denied any knowledge of the shooting or the robbery or anything that had happened.
As detectives watch from the next room, Kenda ratchets up the pressure.
We have the clothes you wore the night of the murder. We have the murder weapon. We know that you brought it to your husband this morning.
Jennifer doesn't react well to being cornered. She's accustomed to being in control of things.
Tell me why you killed her.
Stop that.
She doesn't like the way we're asking questions because we're becoming more and more confrontational. How do you explain this? How do you explain your husband's gun being used in murder that you had it in your possession at the time?
But Jennifer has a quick answer. She says the gun must have been stolen.
Do you realize how ludicrous that is? Somebody breaks into your house, takes a gun, uses it in a murder, and puts it back in your house. That's going to be your defense to this.
Get it off your conscience.
More than an hour into questioning, Jennifer's strong exterior begins to crumble.
No!
She has the look of a caged animal. It just comes to the moment when she realizes that there is no way out of this.
I did it.
She finally says, okay, I killed her.
Just like that, Kenda gets what every homicide investigator hopes for, a confession. Jennifer describes in detail how she committed the brutal crime.
She openly admitted to shooting Diane Hood. The plan was to wait outside the community center till she came out and make it look like a robbery, which is what happened.
For Kenda, Jennifer's confession has seemingly made this an open and shut case. But what she says next leads Kenda to believe someone else was also involved in the murder of Diane Hood, and the architect of the plot is still at large.
Jennifer says, I killed her, but it wasn't my idea. How interesting. So when you get to the truth, a very clear picture emerges. Murder by design.
"28-year-old Jennifer Reale has just confessed to shooting mother of three Diane Hood. But what Lt.Joe Kenda can't figure out is why. That is until Jennifer makes a statement that throws the entire homicide division for a loop.
She finally says, okay, I killed her. But it wasn't my idea. Excuse me. Well, for the past 8 months, I've been having an affair with Brian Hood.
Jennifer explains that in early 1990, she met the victim's husband, Brian Hood, at the fitness center, where Jennifer and Brian frequently worked out.
They were in a hot tub at one time together talking. Those flirtatious ways started to draw her in. And that's her real development, or her starting point with Brian Hood.
By early spring, the innocent flirtation had escalated to a full-blown affair.
It started out small and it got very big very quick. And we were falling in love with each other.
They had a fairly substantial affair that seemed to take place mostly at Jennifer's when Ben Reale was not in town.
Jennifer described in detail every time they had sex and where they had it. The first time he made love to her was on top of the washing machine in her house. Then it was in her Jeep Cherokee. Very specific about all the details of her involvement with Brian.
Tell me about this affair. Or tell me why you did.
According to Jennifer, Brian painted a merciful picture about how killing Diane would end her suffering.
Brian said his wife had lupus and she was going to die anyway. He had an insurance policy on his wife for $100,000, and it was a double indemnity policy that if she were to be murdered, he would pay $200,000.
How, Brian?
For a period of months, he discussed with me various methods to have his wife killed. He talked about trying to hire a hitman. He talked about making left-hand turns in the face of oncoming traffic so she would be killed when the car struck the passenger side.
Eventually, Brian decided a staged robbery would be the best way to have Diane killed, and Jennifer should be the one to do it.
He says to her at one point, "We've already committed the sin of adultery, and the sin of murder is no worse." Really?
There's no other choice.
She indicated that She cared so much about him that anything that he told her to do, she would do. That he was her whole life at that time.
She says that Brian's approach to her is based on passages from the Bible. That this is all going to be okay, and if she repents her sins after having killed his wife for him, she won't suffer going to hell. He further says to Jennifer that this armed robbery plan is going to work because the police are stupid and they will believe that this is an armed robbery and they will be forever chasing someone who doesn't exist. He uses this as his final method of convincing her that this plan is going to work. They're going to get the money and live happily ever after.
Jennifer tells Kenda that for more than 3 months, Brian pressured her to help kill his wife. Finally, on the night of September 12th, Jennifer agreed to go through with it.
She presents a damning picture that Brian is not only involved in this, he's the architect of the plot.
That doesn't stop Kenda from throwing Jennifer behind bars.
We put her in the El Paso County Jail, held without bond for first-degree murder.
Kenda prepares an arrest warrant and heads back to the home of Brian Hood.
We handcuff Brian and we throw him in jail.
You're under arrest for first-degree murder. Turn up the chain behind your back, sir.
For conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, solicitation to commit first-degree murder, and first-degree murder. 3 charges.
Kenda worries that Jennifer's testimony may not be enough to convict Brian, and a jury may see this as a case of fatal attraction.
If all we had was Jennifer, we have a case of he said and she said. Those are very difficult for juries to discern.
However, as news of the arrest goes public, one of Brian's friends, a bartender named Frank Patton, comes forward with damning information.
I'm asking him about his wife and his kids, and he just said, I just wish he'd die and get it over with.
Wish my wife was dead.
Less than a week after that conversation, Diane Hood was murdered in cold blood. Fearing for his own life, Frank Patton tells police what Brian said.
His friends were afraid of him. He had approached them about killing his wife. Their immediate thought is, if he could do that, he could do me too. I have to call the police. Excellent. Our phones are open.
As the tips roll in from more of Brian's associates, it becomes clear that he was only using his wife's disease as an excuse to justify murder.
This is not a case of fatal attraction. This is a case of Brian Hood pressuring his friends until he found one that would do his bidding. Now, we have a case, and the matter's going to proceed to trial.
Brian maintains his innocence throughout, but as more witnesses come forward, his case begins to crumble.
We get the family doctor. The doctor says, I told Diane she had the mildest form of lupus. It could be easily controlled with medication, and she should have no difficulty living a normal life. And Brian was clearly aware of that. Brian says to Jennifer and to anyone else that'll listen to him, including the people that testified, she's going to die anyway. No, she's not. And he knows it.
More than a year after Diane Hood was shot and killed, a jury finds Brian Hood guilty on 2 counts of criminal solicitation and 1 count of conspiracy to murder his wife. However, on the charge of first-degree murder, Brian Hood is found not guilty. Instead of life in prison, Brian is sentenced to 37 years.
He's paying the price, but he's not paying the price he should be paying. I think he got away with murder.
In a separate trial 3 months later, Jennifer Reale pleads insanity, claiming she had been brainwashed by Brian. But the jury does not buy her plea, and she is found guilty on both charges.
First-degree murder and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. Sentenced to life without parole at Colorado State Penitentiary. When we were preparing Jennifer to be taken to jail, I said, Jennifer, I have one last question for you. Do you think the police are stupid? She didn't answer me. I don't know why.
It really was satisfying to know that we had basically stood in Diane's shoes after she couldn't defend herself anymore, and we were able to get justice for her when she couldn't do it for herself.
The trials are over, but the lives of two families have been irrevocably changed.
It was just an extreme sadness about what it did to not just the Hood family, but the Reality family. The consequences of an action like that has ramifications that last for generations.
The question remains, what would lead a successful father of three to murder the mother of his own children?
I mean, why not get a divorce and not end up, having your wife killed? That doesn't make any sense to me.
Human nature at its worst, among people who have no reason to behave that way. You've often heard the comment, what does a murderer look like? Well, as it turns out, it looks like
The road is empty except for a single set of tire tracks fading into the dust, and the question that still hangs in the air is simple and brutal. How does a person vanish in broad daylight without leaving behind a scream, a struggle, or a single clear answer? Texas, summer of 2007, heat shimmering above the asphalt like a warning sign, a small town going about its rituals, coffee poured, doors unlocked, trust assumed, and somewhere between morning and nightfall, someone steps out of their life and never comes back. Not a body, not a goodbye, just absence, sharp and sudden, the kind that cuts deeper with every passing year. This is not a story that starts with police tape or flashing lights. It starts with normalcy, the most dangerous camouflage of all. The town sits low and wide, swallowed by flat land and long horizons, a place where everyone knows the make of your truck and the hour you leave for work. In 2007 it was growing, but not fast enough to forget itself, not fast enough to lose the habit of waving at strangers. The victim, because that word will become unavoidable, was known here, not famous, not hidden, just present. A routine life, a predictable path, the kind investigators love, because patterns are supposed to protect you. They didn't. That morning began like hundreds before it. A short drive. A planned stop. A promise to be back before dark. No one marked the time as important. No one thought to remember the clothes, the expression, the last sound of their voice. Later, every detail would become precious, examined, argued over, turned like a stone in a trembling hand. When the call came in, it didn't sound like an emergency. It never does at first. A missed appointment. A phone going straight to voicemail. A truck not where it should be. In Texas, people disappear for hours all the time, dead zones, broken phones, long roads that eat time. But by nightfall the unease had settled in, the kind that makes your skin prickle for no clear reason. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Keys in the wrong place. A half-finished task left untouched. No sign of a struggle, no broken glass, no blood to scream what happened here. Just a life paused mid-sentence. Police canvassed the immediate area, walking the edges of fields, scanning ditches, asking neighbors the same questions they would ask again and again in the years to come. Did you see anything unusual? Did you hear anything? Did you notice a vehicle you didn't recognize? Most answers were no. A few were maybes. One or two would later turn into contradictions. Surveillance cameras were rare then, grainy when they existed at all, and the town offered little more than memories, already blurring at the edges. The first press headline hit before midnight, local resident missing, search underway. By morning, it was colder. Texas disappearance baffles authorities. Search teams found out, volunteers in baseball caps and sunburned faces, walking shoulder to shoulder through scrub and tall grass. Dogs were brought in, noses to the ground, handlers tense, waiting for the signal that never came. Helicopters traced lazy circles overhead, their noise echoing across empty land, stirring hope and fear in equal measure. They found nothing. No clothing. No footprints. No sign the ground had been disturbed. It was as if the person had been erased, lifted cleanly out of the scene. Investigators don't like that word, erased, but they feel it all the same. As days passed, the narrative hardened. This was no simple case of getting lost. Adults with stable lives don't just disappear without a trace. Theories began to circulate, whispered first, then spoken aloud. Voluntary disappearance. Abduction. Foul play. Each possibility carried its own weight, its own set of implications that threatened to tear the community in different directions. Family members clung to hope, scanning every passing vehicle, every face in a crowd. Friends replayed their last conversations, searching for hidden meanings that weren't there at the time. Police built timelines, color-coded charts pinned to walls, each box representing an hour that refused to explain itself. Then there were the man Moy, strange clues that didn't fit neatly anywhere. A reported sighting miles away, later retracted. A gas station receipt that may or may not belong to the missing person. A neighbor who thought they heard an argument, but couldn't be sure if it was that day or another. Each lead burned bright for a moment, then cooled into disappointment. Detectives chased them anyway, because that's what you do when nothing else is left. The file grew thick. The answers did not. The media attention intensified, transforming private grief into public spectacle. Camera crews parked along quiet streets, microphones thrust toward faces that had no words left. Headlines grew sharper, more dramatic. Cold case in the making. Community on edge. Rumors flourished in the vacuum left by facts. Everyone had a theory. Everyone knew someone who knew something. The town, once united by familiarity, began to fracture under suspicion. People locked doors earlier. They looked at each other longer. Trust, once assumed, now had to be earned. Months turned into a year. Birthdays passed uncelebrated. Holidays arrived heavy with absence. The investigation slowed, not from lack of effort, but from lack of material. Without a body, without a crime scene, the case drifted into that gray space detectives dread. Cold, but not forgotten. The file was shelved, then pulled down again, notes revisited, names rechecked. Each time, the same conclusion. Insufficient evidence. No charges. No closure. And yet, the story refused to die. New detectives inherited the case, each bringing fresh eyes and the same frustration. Advances in technology promised breakthroughs, but only if there was something to test. Family members organized searches long after official ones ended, combing land that had already been combed, hoping time had loosened whatever grip had kept the truth hidden. They erected billboards along highways, faces smiling out over speeding traffic, a reminder that this was not just a headline, not just a case number, but a person suspended between past and present. Years later, when the word reopened finally appeared beside the case, it landed like a thunderclap. Not a solution. Not justice. Just a door creaking open again. New tips had come in, some prompted by renewed media interest, others by the slow erosion of secrets that time can bring. People who had stayed silent began to talk, or at least to hint. Old alibis were questioned. Timelines adjusted. The disappearance of 2007 was dragged back into the light, its edges sharper now, its questions louder. But reopening a case doesn't mean answers are waiting patiently inside. It means starting over with the same emptiness, the same void where certainty should be. Investigators return to the beginning, to that ordinary morning, that unremarkable routine. They ask the same questions with new urgency. Who was the last person to see them? Who benefited from their absence? What was missed the first time? Each question echoed, unanswered, bouncing off years of silence. In this town, the disappearance is no longer an event confined to the past. It is a living thing, woven into conversations, into cautionary tales told to newcomers, into the way people glance at empty roads under a blazing sun. The case remains open, its outcome unknown, its impact undeniable. Somewhere between the known and the unknowable, between hope and resignation, the truth waits, or hides. And as the investigation breathes again, so does the fear that whatever happened back then was not an accident, not a mystery of chance, but a deliberate act that has simply outlasted the people trying to explain it. Time does strange things to a case like this. It doesn't heal it. It distorts it. Details soften, edges blur, and memory becomes both weapon and liability. In the weeks after the disappearance, investigators learned quickly that silence can be louder than screams. Phones rang less often. Tips slowed to a trickle. People who had spoken freely at first began to hedge, to forget, to say they weren't sure anymore. Texas sun bleached the fields, seasons turned, and the absence settled into the landscape like a permanent shadow. The detectives went back to the last confirmed movements, walking the timeline minute by minute, second by second, hunting for a fracture point. A place where routine snapped. The victim's phone records were pulled, pored over, every call and missed call scrutinized like a coded message. Nothing jumped out. No frantic goodbye. No suspicious exchange. Just ordinary life, painfully ordinary, right up until it stopped. Bank accounts showed no sudden withdrawals. No signs of planning. No farewell letters tucked into drawers. If this was a voluntary disappearance, it was the cleanest anyone had ever seen. Too clean. Attention shifted outward, to the orbit of people around the victim. Family. Friends. Co-workers. Anyone whose life brushed against theirs in those final hours. Interviews were conducted under fluorescent lights, voices steady at first, then cracking as the questions repeated. Where were you that day? When did you last speak to them? Did they mention anything unusual? Some answers came quickly, rehearsed almost, others tangled themselves into knots. Investigators marked inconsistencies with red ink, small circles that grew darker with every retelling. Not lies, necessarily. But not clarity either. Then there was the vehicle. A detail that refused to behave. Reports conflicted. Some said it was parked where it shouldn't have been. Others insisted it hadn't moved at all. Witness statements disagreed on times, on angles, on whether they had really seen it, or just thought they had. In a town where trucks blur together and memories borrow from one another, certainty became elusive. The vehicle was examined, searched inch by inch, but yielded nothing more than dust and the stale smell of heat. No blood. No signs of a struggle. Just another dead end. As weeks stretched into months, the investigation narrowed, not by choice, but by exhaustion. Resources were finite. Other crimes demanded attention. The disappearance slipped down the priority list, though no one said it out loud. Detectives carried it with them anyway, a nagging presence, a case that refused to sit quietly. Late at night, they revisited files, staring at photographs until they lost meaning, hoping repetition would conjure insight. Sometimes it almost did. Sometimes it just made the frustration sharper. The community felt it too. The initial unity frayed under the strain of unanswered questions. Rumors hardened into accusations. A neighbor stopped making eye contact. A friend's kindness was reinterpreted as guilt. In small towns, suspicion spreads faster than facts, and once it takes root, it's nearly impossible to uproot. People whispered about secret lives, about debts, about relationships no one could prove existed. Every theory filled the void left by evidence, and none could be confirmed or dismissed outright. Years passed. The case grew cold in the official sense, but emotionally it never cooled. Birthdays came and went, each one another marker of time stolen. The missing person's name became shorthand, a reference point for loss. New residents learned the story the way you learn local legends, with a mix of curiosity and caution. Don't drive that road at night. Lock your doors. Remember what happened in 2007. The disappearance became a warning etched into communal memory. Inside the evidence room, the boxes sat untouched for long stretches, gathering a thin layer of dust. Technology advanced outside those walls, promising new ways to see old problems. DNA databases expanded. Cell phone tracking grew more precise. Digital footprints became harder to erase. Every advancement brought renewed hope and renewed disappointment. Without physical evidence, innovation had nothing to latch onto. The case was a locked door without a keyhole. Then, slowly, cracks began to form. Not in the evidence, but in people. Time has a way of loosening tongues, of making secrets heavier to carry. A tip came in years later, vague but unsettling, hinting at something overlooked. It didn't name names. It didn't offer proof. But it suggested that the disappearance wasn't as clean as it appeared, that someone had been closer to the center of it than investigators realize. The lead was logged, followed, and ultimately stalled, but it left a residue of doubt that refused to be wiped away. Another tip followed. Then another. None were explosive. All were fragments. A memory jogged by a new segment. A conscience stirred by age. A grudge that had outlived its usefulness. Detectives, some of them new to the case, began to sense a pattern, not in the tips themselves, but in what they implied. This wasn't random violence. This wasn't chance. If something happened in 2007, it happened within reach of the victim's ordinary world. Someone knew more than they had said. The decision to reopen the case was not dramatic. No press conference. No triumphant announcement. Just paperwork, meetings, and a quiet acknowledgement that the past still had unfinished business. Old files were digitized. Witnesses were recontacted, their older statements laid side by side with new interviews. Time had altered their stories in subtle ways. Some details sharpened. Others faded. A few changed entirely. Investigators listened closely, not just to what was said, but to what wasn't. Re-examining the case meant re-examining assumptions. What if the timeline was wrong? What if the last confirmed sighting wasn't actually the last? What if the absence of evidence was itself a clue, pointing toward planning, toward familiarity? These questions reopened old wounds, stirred old fears. For the family, it was a cruel revival of hope, a reminder that closure had been promised before and withheld. For the town, it was a reopening of scars that had never fully healed. As the investigation gained momentum again, so did the attention. True crime podcasts dissected the disappearance, drawing listeners from far beyond Texas. Armchair detectives built theories, some insightful, others reckless. The case file, once confined to a few desks, now lived online, its details debated by strangers who felt a sense of ownership over the mystery. This exposure brought new tips, but it also brought noise, a flood of speculation that threatened to drown out substance. Still, among the chaos, something shifted. Detectives noticed a name resurfacing, not often, not prominently, but persistently. A peripheral figure. Someone who had always been just outside the spotlight, just beyond suspicion. Their statements from 2007 were unremarkable, forgettable even. But revisited now, they raised questions. Small discrepancies. A timeline that didn't quite align. Nothing enough to accuse. Enough to watch. The reopened case did not deliver answers quickly. It delivered tension. Every interview felt like a chess move, every document a potential trapdoor. Investigators moved carefully, aware that time had given potential suspects space to refine their stories, to bury evidence deeper, to convince themselves they were safe. But time also made mistakes harder to remember, lies harder to maintain. Pressure, applied slowly, began to tell. In quiet moments, the detectives wondered what it must have been like in those final hours. Whether the victim sensed something wrong. Whether there was a moment of realization, a flash of fear. Or whether it ended before awareness could catch up. These questions had no place in reports, but they haunted the people tasked with finding answers. Because unresolved cases don't just belong to the past. They bleed into the present, shaping every decision, every doubt. As the case moved forward again, one truth became impossible to ignore. The disappearance of 2007 was not an isolated event locked in time. It was a fracture that had spread, influencing lives, shaping behavior, leaving an imprint that no amount of distance could erase. And somewhere, buried beneath years of silence and sun-scorched land, the truth remained, patient and unmoved, waiting for the moment when the pressure of reopening would finally force it into the light, or confirm that some mysteries are built to endure. Reopening the case didn't bring clarity. It brought noise. Old voices layered over new ones, facts competing with memories, certainty dissolving under scrutiny. Detectives learned quickly that time doesn't just hide evidence, it rearranges it, shifts the weight of details, until what once felt solid becomes questionable. The first weeks after reopening were spent untangling contradictions that had quietly settled into the file like sediment. Statements once accepted without challenge were now read with suspicion. Why had that interview ended so quickly? Why had that lead never been followed? Why did this timeline feel too neat? The focus narrowed to the hours that mattered most, a tight window where everything could have gone wrong. Investigators reconstructed the day again, mapping movements across the town, tracing routes along highways that cut through open land and vanish into nothing. They drove those roads themselves, feeling the distance, noting the blind spots, the places where a vehicle could pull over unseen. Texas is full of space, and space can be an accomplice. It offers privacy. It swallows sound. It forgives mistakes. Witnesses were called back in, some reluctantly, others with a strange eagerness, as if they had been waiting for this moment. Faces were older now, lined with years that had passed whether they wanted them to or not. Some people struggled to remember. Others remembered too much, stories polished by repetition. Detectives listened for hesitation, for overconfidence, for the subtle tells that betray discomfort. One witness corrected themselves too quickly. Another bristled at questions that should have been harmless. None of it proved anything. All of it mattered. The phone records were revisited with updated tools, patterns emerging where before there had been only lists. Analysts noticed gaps, periods of silence that stood out against the usual rhythm of communication. Were they meaningful? Or coincidence? In a case starved of certainty, even coincidence demanded attention. A ping here. A missed call there. A device that went quiet and never came back online. The absence of data became as suspicious as data itself. Then there was the rumor that refused to die, the one investigators had dismissed early on because it sounded too dramatic, too convenient. A confrontation. Raised voices. A moment of anger that spiraled out of control. At the time, it had been unsupported, second-hand, impossible to place. Now, years later, pieces of it resurfaced from different mouths, told in different ways, always just out of reach of confirmation. No one claimed to have seen it. Everyone claimed to have heard about it. The story hovered at the edge of the case, daring detectives to either embrace it or finally bury it. Forensic re-examination yielded little in the way of physical evidence, but it sharpened questions about what was missing. No personal items recovered. No clothing found discarded. No trace left behind that could be conclusively tied to a violent act. It suggested control. Familiarity. A situation where panic didn't have time to erupt. Investigators began to consider scenarios that didn't involve force, at least not at first. An invitation. A trusted interaction. Something that didn't immediately trigger alarm. The community reacted to the renewed scrutiny with mixed emotions. Some welcomed it, desperate for answers, convinced that justice was only delayed, not denied. Others grew defensive, wary of old suspicions being stirred back to life. Doors closed more quickly during interviews. Phones went unanswered. In small towns, memory and reputation are intertwined, and reopening a case means reopening judgments people thought they had escaped. Media attention surged again, reframing the disappearance for a new audience. Headlines grew sharper. Cold case takes new turn. Investigators zero in on familiar face. Even without arrests, the implication was enough to unsettle. Online forums dissected every development, naming suspects without restraint, dragging private lives into public view. Detectives had to work against the tide, filtering useful information from reckless speculation. Every false tip cost time. Every accusation risked poisoning the well. Still, progress crept forward in subtle ways. A timeline discrepancy that once seemed trivial now stood out as glaring. A witness who had placed themselves in one location was now contradicted by another account, supported by a detail no one had noticed before. Not proof, but pressure. The kind that makes people reconsider what they've been willing to say. Investigators leaned into that pressure, returning with follow-up questions, revisiting scenes with witnesses, asking them to walk through their movements step by step. Some complied. Some resisted. One name surfaced again, this time with more weight. Not a new suspect, not officially, but someone whose proximity to the victim was undeniable. Someone who had been present in the narrative from the beginning, so familiar they had blended into the background. Their story hadn't changed much over the years, which at first glance suggested honesty. But consistency can also be rehearsed. Detectives compared early interviews to recent ones, noting where details aligned too perfectly, where emotion felt practiced rather than raw. Financial records were examined again, this time with a wider lens. Not just the victim's accounts, but those around them. Patterns of stress emerged. Debts. Disputes. Motives that wouldn't have made headlines, but mattered in real life. None of it screamed homicide. All of it whispered possibility. In unresolved cases, whispers are sometimes all you get. As weeks turned into months, the reopened investigation began to feel like a slow tightening, a net drawn inch by inch. Detectives avoided dramatic moves. No confrontations. No arrests. They understood that patience was their most valuable tool. Time had protected whoever knew the truth for years. It could also betray them. Memory fades. Stories crack. People grow tired of carrying what they thought they'd buried. Family members watched from the sidelines, hope and dread locked in constant tension. Each update promised movement, yet risked disappointment. They learned to read between the lines of official statements, to measure optimism in tone rather than words. For them, reopening the case was not an abstract process. It was a reopening of grief, a reminder that healing had been suspended by uncertainty. Closure remained a concept, not a reality. In private moments, investigators debated theories that would never make it into reports. Accidental death covered up in panic. A crime of opportunity, by someone passing through. A deliberate act planned in advance. Each scenario had holes. Each required assumptions that couldn't yet be proven. The absence of a body loomed over every discussion, a barrier and a shield. Without it, certainty remained elusive. With it, the entire case could change in an instant. The land itself offered no answers. Fields had been plowed and replanted. Roads resurfaced. Buildings torn down and replaced. Whatever traces might have existed in 2007 were long gone, absorbed by time and development. Investigators were left with people, and people are unpredictable evidence. They lie. They forget. They protect themselves. They also slip, especially when they believe the danger has passed. As the reopened investigation pushed forward, a sense of inevitability began to settle in. Not that answers were guaranteed, but that the silence surrounding the disappearance was no longer absolute. Something had shifted. Conversations grew more cautious. Eyes lingered when certain names were mentioned. It was the kind of change detectives recognize instinctively, the subtle tightening of a story that has been told too long without challenge. The disappearance remained unsolved. No arrests were made. No remains recovered. But the case no longer slept. It breathed again, quietly, persistently, reminding everyone involved that unresolved truth has a way of resurfacing when least expected. Somewhere between the roads that stretch endlessly under the Texas sun and the memories that refuse to fade, the events of 2007 waited, unchanged by time, daring the present to finally confront them. Pressure does not announce itself when it arrives. It accumulates. It seeps into conversations, into pauses, into the way people answer questions they've answered before. By the time investigators felt it, the case had already shifted. The reopened file was no longer just a historical document. It was active, breathing, reacting. Every phone call carried weight now. Every knock on a door had consequences. Detectives began working outward from the inner circle, widening their scope not by distance, but by influence. Who had access? Who had opportunity? Who knew the victim's routines well enough to exploit them? Familiarity became the most dangerous variable. Strangers leave chaos. Familiar people leave silence. And silence was all this case had ever known. They returned to the places that mattered, not as they were in 2007, but as they existed now, altered by time. A field that once stretched open was now bordered by fencing. A roadside pull-off had become a construction zone. A business that once stood on a corner was gone, replaced by something new, something oblivious to what had preceded it. Investigators stood there anyway, imagining the past overlaid onto the present, reconstructing moments that left no trace behind. The exercise was imperfect, but necessary. Sometimes understanding comes not from evidence, but from environment. One location drew particular attention. It had been mentioned casually years earlier, dismissed as irrelevant. Too far away. Too inconvenient. Too unlikely. Now, re-examined through a different lens, it felt wrong to have ignored it. The route to it aligned too well with the timeline. The opportunity was there. The visibility was low. Detectives didn't announce their renewed interest. They observed. They asked indirect questions. They waited to see who noticed. In interviews, cracks widened. A witness contradicted themselves on a detail they had once been confident about. Another suddenly remembered something they had previously sworn they couldn't recall. Memory is a fragile thing, but guilt has a way of sharpening it selectively. Investigators didn't accuse. They let silence do the work. People fill silence when they are uncomfortable. They offer information they weren't asked for. They over-explain. Every word was logged, compared, weighed. The name that had been hovering at the edge of the case moved closer to the center. Still unofficial. Still uncharged. But no longer invisible. Detectives requested another interview, framing it as routine, a standard follow-up in a reopened case. The response was delayed. Not a refusal, but not immediate compliance either. That hesitation was noted. When the interview finally happened, it was calm, almost friendly. Too calm. The answers came quickly, smoothly, like lines rehearsed in private. Investigators listened for what was missing. Emotion. Uncertainty. Fear. The things innocent people often can't hide. Meanwhile, forensic accounting uncovered more tension than previously understood. Financial stress that hadn't risen to the level of alarm in 2007 now painted a different picture. Arguments over money. Disputes that simmered quietly, unnoticed by outsiders. Motives don't have to be dramatic to be lethal. Sometimes they are mundane, born of pressure, resentment, desperation. Investigators didn't jump to conclusions, but the pieces were beginning to form a shape. The absence of physical evidence remained the case's greatest obstacle, and its most unsettling feature. No blood meant no obvious violence. No body meant no definitive crime. It left room for alternative explanations, some benign, others sinister. Voluntary disappearance was raised again, if only to be eliminated conclusively. Detectives dug into travel records, employment histories, social security usage. Nothing. No trace beyond 2007. No reinvention. No new identity. The idea collapsed under scrutiny. Whatever happened, the victim had not chosen it. As the investigation deepened, so did the emotional toll. Detectives carried the case home with them, replaying interviews in their heads, scribbling notes late into the night. Cold cases demand patience, but reopened ones demand resolve. You're not just chasing the past. You're challenging it. You're telling people, who have lived comfortably, with a secret that the comfort is ending. That kind of work changes you. The family felt the shift too. Updates became more frequent, more cautious in tone. Phrases like significant developments replaced vague reassurances. Hope flared again, bright and dangerous. They prepared themselves for every possible outcome, knowing none of them would truly be enough. Even answers can wound. Especially after so long. Then came the moment that redefined the reopened case. Not a confession. Not an arrest. A discovery. Small. Easily overlooked by anyone who didn't know exactly what they were searching for. A detail buried in an old report, cross-referenced with new information, suddenly stood out. It was the kind of thing that makes investigators stop mid-sentence, the air shifting in the room. How did we miss this? Why didn't it matter then? Why does it matter now? The detail pointed back to the same familiar figure, tightening the circle further. It didn't prove guilt. It didn't even prove deception. But it established opportunity in a way that could no longer be explained away. Combined with inconsistencies, with motive, with proximity, it transformed suspicion into focus. The case was no longer drifting. It had a direction. Surveillance followed. Subtle. Legal. Quiet. Detectives watched patterns, routines unchanged by the passage of years. Some habits endure. Others don't. They noted reactions when certain topics surfaced in the media. They monitored communications, looking for shifts, for agitation. Guilt doesn't always manifest as panic. Sometimes it shows up as control, as an effort to manage perception. Investigators looked for that too. The town sensed something was happening. Conversations dropped when strangers entered rooms. Speculation reignited, sharper now, more personal. People revisited old assumptions, wondering who they had trusted, who they might have been wrong about. The disappearance was no longer just a tragedy. It was a test of collective memory, of whether the truth could survive years of silence and denial. Still, the case refused to break open cleanly. Every advance was met with resistance. Alibis, while imperfect, existed. Physical proof remained elusive. Prosecutors were consulted, cautious, reminding investigators of the standard required to move forward. Suspicion was not enough. Patterns were not enough. In court, doubt is king, and this case was built on it. The land was searched again, guided by new theories, new coordinates. Ground-penetrating radar scanned areas long dismissed. Cadaver dogs were brought in, their handlers watching intently for any sign of recognition. Hours passed. Days passed. The results were inconclusive. Not a failure. Not a success. Just more waiting. More uncertainty. For some investigators, frustration crept in. Years of work, of careful rebuilding, seemed to hover on the edge of meaning without crossing into resolution. Others saw it differently. The case was closer than it had ever been. Silence had been disrupted. Pressure applied. People were watching their words now. That mattered. In long unsolved cases, momentum is fragile. But once it exists, it can be enough. As Part 4 of the story unfolded, the disappearance of 2007 remained unresolved in the technical sense. No charges. No remains. No final answers. But the illusion of safety that had settled over the years was gone. The reopened investigation had changed the landscape, turning the past into an active threat. For whoever knew the truth, time was no longer an ally. It was a narrowing corridor, closing slowly, inevitably, with every question asked and every silence recorded. And somewhere in the spaces between interviews and searches, between memory and fact, the truth pressed back, resistant, but not unreachable, waiting to see whether this time, the weight of reopening would finally be enough to force it into the open. By the time the investigation reached this stage, nothing felt theoretical anymore. Every question carried intent. Every silence felt deliberate. Detectives understood they were no longer chasing what happened, but how long it had been hidden and by whom. The case had matured into something heavier, darker, shaped not just by loss, but by endurance. Whatever truth lay at the center of the 2007 disappearance had survived years of scrutiny, neglect, and chance. That alone suggested it was not fragile. The familiar figure, never named publicly, never officially labeled, had become unavoidable in internal discussions. Not because of one explosive revelation, but because of accumulation. Proximity layered on proximity. Opportunity stacked against opportunity. Investigators charted interactions, mapping who crossed paths with whom and how often. The victim's routines, once thought boringly predictable, now looked vulnerable. Patterns are only safe until someone else knows them too well. A second round of interviews began, quieter than the first but more pointed. Detectives asked the same questions in different orders, phrased slightly differently, watching reactions rather than listening for answers. People rarely remember lies the same way twice. Truths bend under pressure. Lies fracture. In one interview, a timeline shifted by minutes. In another, a detail was volunteered that had never been mentioned before. Small things. But small things had been all this case ever offered. Investigators also revisited relationships long considered peripheral. Not just romantic or familial, but transactional. Who owed whom? Who resented whom? Who had reason to fear exposure or loss? The deeper they dug, the clearer it became that the disappearance did not exist in isolation. It intersected with tensions that had been invisible to outsiders, the kind that simmer quietly until they don't. The lack of a body continued to dictate strategy. Without physical remains, the case would rise or fall on circumstantial strength. Prosecutors made that clear. The story had to be airtight. Motive, means, opportunity, and behavior after the fact, all aligned. Investigators adjusted accordingly, focusing not on dramatic gestures, but on consistency. What did people do after 2007? What changed? What didn't? Sometimes guilt doesn't erupt. Sometimes it calcifies. Digital forensics offered a narrow, but promising avenue. Old devices were re-examined where possible. Archived data was pulled from systems that hadn't existed when the case first opened. Deleted messages, partial logs, fragments of communication surfaced, not enough to tell a full story, but enough to hint at coordination, at conversations that ended abruptly. Analysts flagged a cluster of interactions that stopped suddenly around the time of the disappearance. Coincidence again? Or something else? The town's atmosphere thickened as whispers resurfaced. People began to connect dots they had avoided before. A comment overheard years ago. A strange behavior dismissed at the time. A vehicle seen in the wrong place. Memory is unreliable, but collective memory can be persuasive. Detectives treated it carefully, aware of the danger of confirmation bias. Still, they listened. Patterns emerged not in facts, but in perception. Certain names made people uncomfortable. Certain questions ended conversations. Then came a moment investigators had been waiting for, though they hadn't known it. A witness reached out unprompted. Not with a confession. Not with a smoking gun. With hesitation. The kind that suggests internal debate, a long-standing argument finally tipping toward disclosure. The information was incomplete, emotionally charged, and difficult to verify. But it aligned with existing suspicions in a way that could not be ignored. For the first time, the narrative gained texture. A sequence. A sense of escalation. According to this account, the disappearance did not begin as a disappearance at all. It began as a meeting. Planned. Familiar. Unremarkable. No fear. No witnesses alarmed by raised voices. If true, it explained the absence of chaos, the lack of immediate alarm. It suggested a moment where everything still looked normal. And then, something shifted. A decision made quickly. A mistake compounded by panic. Investigators moved carefully. They corroborated what they could without revealing the source. They checked timelines, compared phone activity, tested the plausibility of movement between locations. The theory held, not perfectly, but well enough to justify deeper pursuit. It reframed old evidence, turning overlooked details into potential indicators. What once seemed meaningless now carried weight. Surveillance intensified, still discreet, still legal. Detectives observed behavior with fresh eyes, looking not for guilt, but for stress. Changes in routine. Defensive reactions to unrelated questions. The subject appeared composed, cooperative, even helpful. But composure can be a mask. Investigators had learned long ago that the calmest people often carry the heaviest secrets. At the same time, searches expanded again. Not randomly, but surgically. Areas once dismissed were re-examined based on new theory. The land, altered though it was, still held possibilities. Cadaver dogs returned, trained to work through decades of scent degradation. Ground scans focused on specific coordinates. The work was slow, methodical, physically exhausting. And again, results hovered just short of definitive. No remains. No clear confirmation. Just anomalies that demanded explanation. The family was briefed cautiously. Investigators did not promise answers. They never did. But the tone had changed. The case no longer felt static. It was moving, inching forward through resistance. Hope returned, tempered by years of disappointment. They understood now that truth, if it came, might be ugly, incomplete, painful. They wanted it anyway. Public pressure mounted as rumors of progress leaked. Media outlets speculated openly about suspects, motives, outcomes. Detectives pushed back where they could, knowing premature exposure could collapse the case. The goal was not headlines. It was resolution. Still, the attention had an effect. People talked. Old loyalties weakened. Silence became harder to maintain. Internally, investigators debated timing. When to confront. When to wait. When to apply pressure directly. Cold cases reward patience, but reopening one changes the equation. Too slow, and momentum dies. Too fast, and mistakes are made. The balance was delicate. Every move was scrutinized, every decision weighed against years of failure. A critical interview was scheduled, this time under different circumstances. More formal. More structured. The questions were narrow, precise, designed to box in answers. The subject sensed it immediately. Body language shifted. Pauses lengthened. For the first time, frustration surfaced. Not anger. Not fear. Frustration. The irritation of someone who believed this chapter was closed, now forced to relive it. Investigators pressed gently, then harder, revisiting inconsistencies, presenting contradictions without accusation. They watched as explanations grew more complex, less intuitive. Simple stories don't need reinforcement. Complicated ones do. The interview ended without confession, without collapse. But it left a mark. Both sides knew something had changed. As days passed, detectives reviewed the recording repeatedly, catching details missed in real time. A phrase repeated unconsciously. A timeline corrected too quickly. A moment of silence that lingered longer than necessary. None of it was proof. All of it was fuel. The case edged closer to a threshold where action would become unavoidable. Yet the disappearance remained officially unsolved. No charges filed. No remains recovered. The law moves on evidence, not instinct. Investigators knew that. They respected it. But they also knew something else. The silence surrounding the 2007 disappearance was no longer intact. It had been punctured, and air was escaping. In the town, people felt it. Conversations changed. Eyes followed familiar figures with new curiosity. The past no longer felt distant. It felt present, intrusive, demanding attention. The case had become a mirror, forcing the community to confront what it had chosen not to see for years. As Part 5 closed, the investigation stood at an uneasy midpoint. Not stalled. Not solved. Balanced between revelation and resistance. The truth was closer than it had ever been, but still guarded, still incomplete. For investigators, for the family, for the town, one reality was now impossible to deny. Whatever happened in Texas in 2007 was not gone. It had simply been waiting. By now, the investigation had reached a stage investigators rarely discuss publicly, the phase where evidence stops being about discovery and starts being about leverage. The facts on the table were still incomplete, but their arrangement mattered more than their volume. Every interview, every document, every quiet observation was being positioned carefully, not to accuse, but to test resistance. When truth is close, it pushes back. And something, somewhere in this case, was pushing back hard. Detectives began to notice behavioral shifts that couldn't be charted on timelines or pinned to corkboards. Calls that once came back immediately now went unanswered. Friendly cooperation cooled into guarded politeness. Legal counsel appeared where none had been before. These changes were not illegal. They were not even surprising. But they were telling. People who feel safe don't reorganize their lives around caution. The familiar figure remained central, though still unnamed in public. Internally, the file around them grew thicker by the day. Investigators mapped stress points, moments where pressure seemed to register. Financial records showed subtle, but notable changes following the disappearance. Not sudden wealth. Not obvious guilt. Just adjustments. A debt resolved quietly. A move delayed. A decision that, in hindsight, felt reactive rather than planned. These were not crimes. They were reactions. And reactions suggest cause. At the same time, investigators widened their lens again, looking for corroboration beyond human testimony. Environmental data, old weather reports, road maintenance schedules, anything that could anchor movement or opportunity to something immutable. They discovered that on the day of the disappearance, a stretch of road had been briefly closed for work, diverting traffic along a less visible route. At the time, it meant nothing. Now, it suggested privacy. A window. A chance for something to happen unseen. This discovery didn't change the case overnight, but it reframed it. Investigators returned to witnesses who had mentioned unfamiliar vehicles, odd detours, moments that felt insignificant at the time. Some memories sharpened under renewed questioning. Others collapsed entirely. One witness admitted they had withheld a detail years earlier, not out of malice, but out of fear of being wrong. Fear has a way of distorting responsibility. That detail, small as it was, aligned disturbingly well with the revised timeline. Search efforts resumed again, this time with an urgency that bordered on desperation. Not because investigators believed remains would be found easily, but because the theory demanded testing. Landowners were contacted. Permissions granted reluctantly, then more freely as the gravity of the situation set in. Crews moved slowly, methodically, scanning soil, vegetation, depressions that didn't quite match their surroundings. The work was exhausting, repetitive, emotionally draining. Each false alarm carried hope and disappointment in equal measure. No remains surfaced. But something else did. Evidence of disturbance. Not conclusive. Not recent. But enough to suggest the land had been altered intentionally at some point in the past. Investigators documented everything, careful not to oversell what they couldn't yet prove. In cases like this, exaggeration is fatal. The truth doesn't need help. It needs patience. Behind closed doors, prosecutors and investigators debated strategy. The question was no longer whether a crime had occurred, but whether it could be proven without the one thing juries expect above all else. A body. History offered examples of successful prosecutions without one, but they were rare, and they required overwhelming circumstantial strength. The bar was high. Everyone in the room knew it. Attention turned to behavior after the disappearance, the long arc of years that followed. Who pushed for searches? Who avoided them? Who spoke publicly? Who stayed silent? Grief manifests differently, investigators knew that, but patterns still emerge. Some people seek the spotlight. Others avoid it. Neither proves guilt. But avoidance paired with proximity paired with inconsistency begins to form a narrative that's hard to ignore. A breakthrough came quietly, almost invisibly. A record overlooked not because it was hidden, but because it had seemed irrelevant at the time. A service appointment. A timestamp. A location logged automatically by a system never designed for criminal investigation. In 2007, it had been background noise. Now, revisited with purpose, it placed a key individual closer to a critical location than they had ever admitted. Not at the exact moment. Not undeniably. But close enough to raise questions that could no longer be deflected. When confronted gently with this information, the response was telling. Surprise came too late. Confusion felt manufactured. The explanation offered was plausible, but layered, requiring several assumptions to hold at once. Investigators let it stand. They didn't challenge it immediately. They wanted to see if it would change later. Lies rarely stay still. The pressure began to show in subtle physical ways. Tension in shoulders. Averted eye contact. A tightening jaw when certain topics arose. These details never appear in official summaries, but they live in investigators' memories, guiding instincts sharpened by experience. This wasn't panic. It was vigilance. The kind that comes from guarding something fragile. Meanwhile, the family's patience was tested again. Hints of progress reached them through official channels, always cautious, always incomplete. They had learned to protect themselves from hope, to keep expectations low. Still, the idea that someone close, someone known, might be responsible reopened wounds that had never fully closed. Betrayal adds a different kind of pain to loss. It rewrites the past. The town, too, felt the tension. Speculation hardened into belief for some, denial for others. Lines were drawn quietly. Long-time friendships cooled. People wondered who had known what, and when. The disappearance, once an abstract tragedy, now felt personal, accusatory. It asked uncomfortable questions about community, about how well people truly know one another. Investigators reached a critical decision point. Enough pieces had aligned to justify a direct confrontation, not an accusation, but a strategic interview designed to collapse the narrative under its own weight. Preparation was meticulous. Questions were sequenced to box in explanations, to revisit the same facts from different angles, to test consistency under sustained pressure. The interview began calmly. Polite. Professional. It ended hours later in a very different place. Not with a confession. Not with an arrest. But with visible strain. Answers slowed. Corrections multiplied. At one point, silence stretched long enough to feel deliberate. When the interview concluded, investigators exchanged looks they didn't need to explain. Something had cracked. Not broken. But cracked. In the days that followed, communication shifted again. Attorneys tightened their involvement. Statements were issued instead of conversations. The case moved closer to the threshold where legal action would become inevitable, one way or another. Investigators compiled their findings into a cohesive narrative, aware that every assumption would be challenged, every gap exploited. And still, the absence of the victim loomed over everything. Without remains, without a definitive scene of violence, the story risked feeling theoretical to outsiders. Investigators knew that. They also knew that people don't vanish without cause, not like this, not without leaving some imprint behind. The imprint was there. Scattered. Faint. but undeniable. As Part 6 settled into place, the reopened investigation stood on the edge of transformation. The mystery of the 2007 disappearance was no longer defined by what was missing, but by what was emerging under sustained pressure. The silence that had protected the truth for so long was thinning. Cracks were spreading. And whether it ended in confession, discovery, or prosecution, one thing was now certain. This case was no longer waiting. It was moving. Once momentum takes hold in a case like this, it changes the temperature of everything around it. Rooms feel smaller. Questions feel heavier. Even silence feels loud. Investigators sensed it immediately after that last interview, the way the air had shifted, the way answers no longer flowed freely, but had to be measured, guarded, filtered through caution. This was no longer a cold case being reviewed. It was an active threat to someone's carefully maintained version of the past. The team regrouped quietly. No celebrations. No declarations. Just a shared understanding that the case had crossed an invisible line. From this point forward, every move mattered more than ever. One mistake could fracture months of progress. One premature action could send the truth retreating deeper into hiding. They slowed down, paradoxically, choosing precision over speed. Attention turned to corroboration. Not new theories, but reinforcement of existing ones. Investigators revisited every statement connected to the central figure, laying them out chronologically, listening for evolution. Early interviews carried a casual confidence. Later ones revealed caution. The most recent showed control. Control is exhausting. Maintaining it over years leaves traces. Small inconsistencies crept in, not dramatic enough to stand alone, but powerful in accumulation. They focused on one specific window of time, a narrow band of hours that refused to align no matter how often it was adjusted. Multiple witnesses placed the central figure in different locations during that window. None could be definitively proven wrong. None could be definitively right. But when overlaid with newly recovered data, the margin for error shrank. Someone was lying. Or someone was mistaken in a way that conveniently benefited only one person. Digital artifacts continued to yield quiet revelations. Location logs, indirect and incomplete, suggested movement that had never been disclosed. Not fast. Not panicked. Purposeful. Investigators mapped the route repeatedly, driving it themselves, noting how long it took, where cell service dropped, where visibility disappeared. It was a route that made sense only if you knew it well. Only if you had traveled it before. The theory solidified. This was not an impulsive act by a stranger. It was controlled, deliberate, and dependent on familiarity. That realization narrowed the field dramatically. It also raised an unsettling possibility. If the disappearance had been planned, or at least anticipated, then the years of silence that followed were not accidental. They were intentional. Maintained. Behind the scenes, prosecutors grew more involved, attending briefings, challenging assumptions, probing weaknesses. Their questions were blunt. Where is the body? What proves a crime occurred? How do you convince a jury when the victim is still missing? Investigators answered honestly. They acknowledged gaps. They didn't pretend certainty where it didn't exist. Instead, they focused on narrative integrity. A story that holds together under pressure. A story where every action has a logical cause and consequence. Meanwhile, the person at the center of the investigation began to behave differently. Not dramatically. Subtly. A change in routine. A withdrawal from public view. Social interactions reduced to the bare minimum. These were not admissions. They were defensive adaptations. Investigators documented everything, aware that behavioral evidence often speaks loudest when paired with context. The town noticed. People talk. They always do. Someone mentioned seeing the central figure drive a different route than usual. Someone else noted a sudden interest in legal advice for unrelated matters. None of it was illegal. None of it proved guilt. But it reinforced the sense that the past was no longer comfortably buried. Then came another contact. This time, not hesitant. Urgent. A person who had stayed silent for years reached out through an intermediary, unwilling to speak publicly, afraid of consequences. Their information was fragmentary, emotional, but specific in ways previous tips had not been. They described a conversation overheard long ago, a moment that hadn't made sense at the time, but now felt impossible to ignore. A reference to a problem. A solution. A place. Investigators verified what they could. The location existed. The timing aligned roughly with known gaps. The language used matched phrases the central figure had employed in other contexts. It wasn't enough to act on alone. But it tightened the web. Another strand added. Another point of pressure. Search teams returned yet again, guided by this new detail. The land had changed, but some features endure. Tree lines. Drainage patterns. Natural depressions. Crews worked quietly, aware that expectations were high but probabilities remained low. Hours turned into days. Equipment scanned the earth, readings analyzed and reanalyzed. When anomalies appeared, hope surged, only to recede when nothing definitive followed. The frustration was palpable. Investigators knew they were close, but closeness is not resolution. It is a dangerous place, where assumptions can harden into blind spots. Leadership reminded the team constantly, stay disciplined. Let the evidence speak. Don't rush the ending just because you want one. The family oscillated between guarded optimism and exhaustion. They had lived with uncertainty for so long that clarity, even painful clarity, felt preferable to waiting. They asked fewer questions now, listening more closely to what wasn't being said. They sensed, as investigators did, that the case was approaching a moment of reckoning. Internally, preparations began for that moment. Warrants were drafted and redrafted, scrutinized for weakness. Potential charges were discussed hypothetically, always with the same caveat: without remains, every element would be contested. The strategy would have to be flawless. The central figure was contacted again, requested to clarify previous statements. This time, the response came through counsel. Cooperation would continue, they said, but only under specific conditions. It was a legal right. It was also a signal. The days of casual conversation were over. Lines had been drawn. Investigators didn't flinch. They adjusted. They shifted from information gathering to case building, assembling a structure designed to withstand attack. Every document, every recording, every note was reviewed with fresh eyes. Weak points were identified. Strong ones reinforced. The case was no longer just about discovering truth. It was about proving it. As Part 7 unfolded, the disappearance of 2007 felt closer to resolution than ever before, yet still stubbornly incomplete. The truth hovered just beyond reach, obscured by time, silence, and the absence of the one thing that could settle everything instantly. But the pressure was undeniable now. The silence that had protected the past was cracking under sustained scrutiny. Whatever happened next, confession, discovery, or confrontation, it would not be subtle. Years of restraint had built toward a release. And in Texas, under the same white sky that had witnessed a disappearance in 2007, the present was finally catching up to the past. The moment a case shifts from investigation to inevitability is rarely dramatic. It doesn't arrive with sirens or sudden confessions. It settles in quietly, like weight. Investigators felt it in the way conversations changed, in the way doors closed more carefully, in the way the past seemed to press forward, demanding resolution. The disappearance of 2007 had entered its most dangerous phase, not because answers were guaranteed, but because resistance was. The strategy evolved again. Direct pressure had reached its limit. Now came patience. Let time do what force could not. Investigators allowed weeks to pass without visible movement, a calculated stillness designed to test nerves. In unresolved cases, silence can be a tool. It invites mistakes. It gives people space to talk when they believe attention has shifted elsewhere. Behind that silence, the work intensified. Analysts combed through years of communications, not just for what was said, but for when patterns changed. A sudden drop in contact. A reappearance of a number thought forgotten. An interaction that made sense only in retrospect. Digital footprints are never erased entirely. They fade. And faded things become visible again when you know where to look. The central figure remained cautious, maintaining distance through counsel, offering nothing new. On the surface, it looked like control. Underneath, investigators sensed strain. Friends reported subtle changes in demeanor. Sleeplessness. Irritability. A fixation on the case in the news, even while publicly dismissing it. Guilt does not always look like remorse. Sometimes it looks like vigilance. Another witness emerged, this time unintentionally. A casual remark made during an unrelated conversation, passed along to investigators by someone who finally recognized its significance. It was not an accusation. It was an observation. A detail about timing. About presence. About someone being somewhere they had no reason to be. The kind of detail that sticks only after years of context accumulate around it. Investigators verified the claim quietly, tracing it against known records. It aligned disturbingly well. Not perfectly. But well enough to matter. Combined with previous information, it reinforced the same narrow theory. A meeting. A controlled interaction. A disappearance engineered to look like nothing at all. Search efforts resumed once more, this time smaller, more focused. The areas were limited, the expectations tempered. This was not about sweeping land. It was about precision. Teams worked with a different mindset now, looking not for dramatic discoveries, but for confirmation. Evidence of disturbance. Trace indicators. Anything that suggested the theory had touched the physical world. The land resisted. Texas soil holds secrets well. Years of weather, animals, human activity erase signs until even trained eyes struggle to separate anomaly from nature. Each day ended with careful documentation and restrained disappointment. Investigators had learned not to promise themselves outcomes. Hope, in cases like this, must be rationed. Prosecutors pressed for clarity. What could be proven now? What still required corroboration? Investigators responded with progress, not certainty. They outlined behavioral evidence, opportunity, motive, post-event conduct. Strong. Compelling. But still vulnerable without remains. The legal reality loomed over every meeting. This case would demand courage and risk, if it were to move forward without the final piece. Meanwhile, pressure from outside grew. Media speculation intensified. Names circulated more freely online, some accurate, some reckless. Investigators worried about contamination, witnesses influenced by public narratives, memories reshaped by exposure. They moved quickly to re-interview key individuals, locking in statements before they could be altered by rumor. One interview in particular stood out. A long, emotional conversation with someone who had known both the victim and the central figure. They hadn't seen anything. They hadn't heard a confession. What they offered instead was insight into dynamics, into tension that had been invisible to outsiders. A relationship defined by imbalance. Control masked as familiarity. Trust exploited quietly over time. It wasn't evidence in the legal sense. But it gave context. And context can make behavior understandable. Investigators began to prepare for the possibility that the truth might never be fully recoverable in physical form. That justice, if it came, would be incomplete. They discussed how to present absence as evidence, how to explain to a jury that sometimes the most powerful proof is what isn't there. No bank activity. No sightings. No digital life. No remains, but also no life. The central figure's circle tightened. Support thinned. People grew cautious about association. Some quietly distanced themselves. Others asked questions they had avoided for years. Isolation is a side effect of suspicion. It changes how people move through the world. Investigators observed, knowing isolation can also create opportunity for confession, for error, for collapse. Then came a shift no one had anticipated. A procedural complication threatened to derail months of work. A challenge to the admissibility of key evidence. A technicality rooted in the passage of time, in systems never designed to preserve information for decades. The setback was significant. Investigators recalibrated, searching for alternative paths, backup strategies. The case wavered, but did not break. In response, they leaned harder into human evidence. Testimony. Behavior. Consistency. Or the lack of it. They re-examined earlier interviews, noticing how certain answers had evolved in response to perceived threat. Lies adapt. Truth remains stubbornly simple. That difference became more pronounced the closer the investigation drew to confrontation. The family was informed of the complication, the obstacles ahead. They listened quietly, absorbing the reality they had lived with for years. Progress did not guarantee closure. It never had. But the effort mattered. The refusal to let the case fade mattered. Even if the ending was uncertain, the pursuit was not. As Part 8 unfolded, the disappearance of 2007 stood at a crossroads. The evidence was strong but incomplete. The pressure was high but controlled. The truth was near but still hidden behind layers of time and intent. Investigators knew that the next phase would demand decisive action, one way or another. Waiting had reached its limit. The past had been patient for 17 years. It would not wait much longer. The decision came quietly, in a closed room with no windows and no press waiting outside. After years of restraint, investigators chose movement over caution. Not because the case was complete, but because time was no longer neutral. Every delay now risked erosion, memories fading, witnesses retreating, evidence slipping further into ambiguity. If this case was going to move, it had to move now. A coordinated plan unfolded across agencies. Subpoenas were reissued with narrower scope, but sharper intent. Financial records once deemed irrelevant were revisited through a new lens: timing, proximity, motive rather than amounts. Small transactions resurfaced, ordinary on their own, suspicious in sequence. Patterns formed. Not proof of a crime, but proof of preparation. Investigators scheduled a final round of interviews. No surprises. No accusations. Just questions asked one last time, carefully, methodically. The goal wasn't confession. It was contrast, between what had been said before and what could still be said now. Truth tends to settle. Lies keep shifting. The central figure arrived guarded, accompanied, composed. Years of anticipation had rehearsed this moment. The answers were controlled, polished, legally sound. But control has limits. Over hours, fatigue chipped away at precision. Timelines blurred. Details contradicted earlier versions, subtly but undeniably. Investigators didn't interrupt. They let the inconsistencies breathe. When confronted, not aggressively, but clearly, the response was telling. Not anger. Not denial. Silence. A pause that stretched too long. In that pause, something changed. It wasn't guilt revealed, it was calculation abandoned. The interview ended without fireworks, but everyone in the room understood. This was no longer a question of if something had happened, only how much could be proven. Outside the interview room, parallel efforts advanced. Search teams followed a refined model built from years of theory, witness insight, and behavioral analysis. No broad sweeps. No media spectacle. Just a narrow zone revisited with modern tools and patient intent. Cadaver dogs alerted, not decisively, but enough to justify further examination. Soil samples were collected. Marked. Logged. Sent away. Days passed. Then weeks. Results arrived incrementally, forcing investigators to live in uncertainty once more. Some findings were inconclusive. Others unsettling. Trace evidence suggested disturbance consistent with human activity long ago, heavily degraded by time. Not a discovery that would make headlines, but not nothing either. Prosecutors weighed options. Proceed without remains and risk acquittal. Or wait, possibly forever, for confirmation that might never come. The legal threshold loomed large. This would be a circumstantial case, built on behavior, opportunity, and absence. A case that asked a jury to accept that the lack of a body was not a lack of truth. Behind the scenes, negotiations began. Not plea deals, conversations. Quiet inquiries through counsel. The message was measured, cooperation could shape outcomes. Silence would not stop momentum. The response was predictable but revealing. No admissions. No cooperation. Just distance. Distance that, after years of proximity, spoke volumes. The media sensed escalation. Leaks appeared. Speculation intensified. Investigators tightened control, aware that public pressure cuts both ways. It can encourage witnesses forward, or push them deeper into fear. One witness, long hesitant, finally reached out. Not with new facts, but with willingness. Willingness to testify. To stand by earlier statements publicly. To stop hiding behind anonymity. That commitment mattered. It changed the calculus. Cases like this are not won by single revelations. They are won by accumulation, people deciding, one by one, that the truth is heavier than the risk of speaking it. The family was informed again. This time, the tone was different. Not cautious optimism. Not guarded hope. Resolve. Investigators explained the path ahead, the risks, the likelihood that the end might be imperfect. The family listened, then asked only one question: are you going to stop? The answer was simple. No. As Part 9 closed, the case stood closer to action than it had in 17 years. Lines had been drawn. Positions taken. The quiet phase was over. Whether through charges, confession, or confrontation, something was coming. The disappearance that once seemed destined to fade was now forcing its way back into daylight. And the people who had lived in its shadow could feel it. The waiting was almost done. The night never fully releases this case. It just thins, like fog lifting enough to see shapes, but never faces. Years after the reopening, after the searches and subpoenas and closed-door meetings, the file still sits warm on desks that refuse to let it cool. Not active. Not closed. Suspended in a state law enforcement rarely admits exists, unfinished, but awake. What changed wasn't the evidence. It was the atmosphere. People in this town started speaking differently, softer, as if the past had learned how to listen. The disappearance stopped being a rumor and returned to being a presence. At diners, conversations stalled when certain names surfaced. At gas stations, eyes lingered a second too long. Everyone sensed that something had shifted, even if no sirens marked the moment. Investigators learned to read those shifts. Behavioral analysts noted patterns that couldn't be logged into databases. The way one house suddenly installed new lights after years of darkness. The way another stopped answering the door entirely. No warrants followed. Just notes. Observations. Time-stamped instincts waiting for corroboration. The primary figure remained untouched by handcuffs, but not by consequence. Associates drifted away. Business relationships cooled. Invitations stopped arriving. In a town that remembers everything, silence can be louder than accusation. Still, legally, the wall held. No body. No direct admission. Only gravity pulling inward, slowly. Then came the call that almost wasn't answered. An elderly voice. Shaking, deliberate. A person who had once known something and spent years convincing themselves they didn't. Memory doesn't disappear, it hides, and it resents being buried. The caller didn't offer names. Just a place. A drive taken once. A turn missed deliberately. A detail so specific it couldn't be guessed. Search teams returned again, under a sky that looked identical to the one from 2007. Same heat. Same dust. Different people. Ground-penetrating radar hummed over Earth that had learned patience. The scan revealed anomalies. Not proof. But promise. Soil disturbed long ago, then left to forget. Excavation followed. Careful. Reverent. Each layer peeled back like history being asked to testify. Nothing definitive emerged. No remains. No objects that could speak clearly. Only traces, chemical echoes that suggested something organic had once been there, then moved. Removed. Or dissolved by time and intent. Frustration crept in, quiet but corrosive. Investigators felt it. The family felt it more. Hope is heavier the longer you carry it. Still, they returned to the same conclusion they had reached years earlier: stopping would be worse than not knowing. Closure was a word other people used. They wanted truth, even if it came fractured. Behind the scenes, legal strategies evolved. Prosecutors explored lesser charges, not to compromise justice, but to create leverage. Obstruction. False statements. Anything that could force pressure into places silence had fortified. Defense teams anticipated this, countering with delays and procedural walls. The chessboard remained crowded. Time passed again. Not in years this time. In moments. One moment stood out. A former associate, once loyal, now tired, entered a station unannounced. No lawyer. No demands. Just exhaustion. The statement was partial. Careful. But it aligned with theories long considered too speculative to voice aloud. It didn't solve the case. It sharpened it. The community reacted in waves. Anger. Relief. Fear. Old divisions reopened. Some people wanted names. Others wanted quiet. Everyone wanted distance from the truth they sensed was approaching, but not yet visible. Murals faded. Vigils stopped. But the case stayed, etched deeper than any memorial. As of now, no arrest has been made. No charges filed. Officially, the disappearance remains unsolved. Unofficially, no one uses that word anymore. They say pending. They say ongoing. They say not over. Because unresolved doesn't mean forgotten. It means alive. Somewhere between memory and evidence, between what can be proven and what is known, this case still breathes. It waits in the pauses of conversation, in the glances that last too long, in the ground that refuses to give up its secrets all at once. And until it does. Texas 2007 is not a cold case. It is a wound that never learned how to close. The timeline stopped behaving the way timelines are supposed to. What once looked linear, last sighting, last call, last confirmed movement, began to bend under scrutiny, folding back on itself in ways that made investigators uneasy. Time didn't just pass in this case. It fractured. And in those fractures, new possibilities surfaced, unsettling and persistent. Part of the problem was familiarity. Too many people thought they knew what had happened, because they thought they knew the victim. The routines. The habits. The predictable routes. But predictability is only visible in hindsight, and hindsight lies when it's comfortable. Investigators began challenging assumptions that had gone unquestioned for years. What if the route wasn't routine that day? What if the meeting wasn't scheduled? What if the last person seen wasn't the last person involved? Old phone records were reinterpreted with fresh intent. Not just calls made, but calls not made. Missed pings. Gaps where communication should have existed but didn't. Silence in the right place can be louder than any conversation. Analysts mapped those silences against known movements of key individuals, and the overlaps were too precise to ignore. Coincidence was still possible. But coincidence, repeated, starts to look deliberate. Witnesses who had once seemed peripheral drifted back into focus. One remembered a sound, metal on gravel, at an hour that didn't align with earlier statements. Another recalled a vehicle that didn't belong, parked where it had no reason to be. These weren't revelations. They were revisions. And revisions change everything. The story the town had been telling itself quietly began to unravel. Investigators returned to the physical environment with a different mindset. Not searching for remains anymore, but for behavior. Tire marks long erased. Pathways that made sense only if you were trying not to be seen. A fence line repaired weeks after the disappearance, never questioned at the time. Repairs are acts of intention. They leave psychological fingerprints even when physical ones are gone. The pressure wasn't public yet, but it was building internally. Task force meetings grew longer. Voices dropped lower. People started choosing their words carefully, aware that anything said now might one day be read aloud in a courtroom. No one wanted to be the reason the case failed, when it was finally within reach. Then came the document. Not new, just forgotten. A report filed early, skimmed once, then buried under years of paperwork. It described a minor interaction, a routine traffic stop, a casual observation, that had seemed meaningless in 2007. Read now, it landed differently. The timing was wrong. The location too convenient. The officer who filed it had no reason to embellish. That made it dangerous. The person referenced in the report was contacted again. This time, the tone was different. No longer informal. No longer hypothetical. The questions were specific. Surgical. The answers were hesitant. Memory, once confident, began to falter. People forget details all the time. But they don't usually forget feelings. And the discomfort was unmistakable. Legal teams were looped in quietly. Hypotheticals became strategies. If this went forward, what would it look like without remains? How strong was behavioral evidence when stacked carefully, patiently, over time? The answer was never certain. But it was no longer impossible. The family sensed the shift without being told. Calls from investigators came more frequently, shorter, heavier. They were no longer being asked to remember. They were being asked to prepare. Prepare for movement. Prepare for disappointment. Prepare for answers that might not look the way justice does on television. In the town, rumors ignited again. Not wild ones, focused ones. Names resurfaced, this time with context. People who had once defended those names fell silent. Silence spread faster than gossip ever had. The disappearance returned to the present tense. And still, nothing broke. No confession. No arrest. Just the slow tightening of a circle that had taken nearly 2 decades to draw. By the end of Part 11, the case stood on the edge of transformation. Not solved. Not stalled. Poised. Like a breath held too long. Everyone involved understood that whatever came next would change the shape of the story forever. Because once a case stops asking what happened and starts asking who knew, there is no going back. The shift from theory to pressure was almost imperceptible, but it changed the temperature of every room the case entered. Investigators stopped asking open questions. They began presenting information, partial, deliberate, enough to test reactions. Truth has weight. Even when it isn't spoken, it presses down on the people standing closest to it. One by one, individuals connected to the final days of the disappearance were reapproached. Not summoned. Invited. The tone was calm, respectful, almost conversational. But the questions landed harder now, framed by years of accumulated context. Where were you really going that afternoon? Who else knew? Why did your story change the second time, then change again years later? Memory faltered under that kind of precision. And when memory fails, instinct takes over. Some became defensive. Others distant. A few tried cooperation, offering fragments in exchange for reassurance. None of it was enough on its own. But together, the fragments began to form a shape, irregular, incomplete, but unmistakably human. A sequence of decisions. A moment that spiraled. An aftermath managed rather than reported. Investigators focused on behavior after the disappearance, a period once overshadowed by the search itself. Who acted too quickly? Who waited too long? Who seemed to know which areas didn't need checking? Grief looks different on everyone, but avoidance has a rhythm, and that rhythm started appearing in familiar places. A key interview reopened the wound. Conducted years earlier, it had been considered inconclusive. Now replayed, it sounded different. Pauses where answers should have been immediate. Over-explanations for simple facts. A laugh, out of place, punctuating a question about timelines. The interviewer at the time hadn't pushed. Now, those moments screamed restraint. New technology added another layer. Voice analysis didn't prove deception, but it highlighted stress spikes aligned with specific topics, locations, not people. Times, not motives. Investigators took note. Patterns don't accuse. They suggest where to look harder. The search radius narrowed again, informed by this behavioral data rather than physical leads. Places once dismissed as too obvious came back into focus. People don't always hide things where no one will look. Sometimes they hide them where everyone already has, and assumes there's nothing left to find. Community tensions surfaced openly for the first time. A town meeting meant to address unrelated issues dissolved into argument. Names were spoken aloud. Accusations weren't made, but implications hung heavy. The past stopped being polite. For some, it was a relief. For others, a threat. The family stood at the center of it all, steady in a way that unsettled those who had hoped time would dull their resolve. They no longer asked when. They asked why it had taken so long. Investigators didn't have an answer that could satisfy them. There never is. Legal thresholds loomed closer. Prosecutors requested mock trials, closed, internal, brutally honest. Could a jury convict without remains? Without a confession? The answer hovered between yes and maybe. Depends on the story. Depends on whether the absence could be framed as intent rather than mystery. As Part 12 drew to a close, pressure replaced patience. Not recklessness. Not haste. Just inevitability. The kind that makes people restless, that pulls at old alliances and tests long-held silence. Somewhere in this tightening circle, someone knew the truth completely. And that knowledge was becoming harder to carry. Because the longer a secret survives, the heavier it becomes. Pressure doesn't announce itself. It settles. It changes posture, tone, sleep. By the time investigators realized how deeply it had embedded itself in this case, it was already shaping decisions on the other side of the table. People were no longer reacting to questions. They were reacting to consequences. The next interview didn't begin with evidence. It began with time. 17 years laid out plainly, without accusation, without drama. 17 years of silence, of birthdays missed, of a room left untouched, because changing it felt like surrender. The room grew quiet. Not defensive quiet. Reflective. That mattered. The person across the table had rehearsed denial for years. But denial requires energy. And energy fades when the story you're protecting no longer serves you. The answers came slower. Less confident. Investigators didn't interrupt. They let the silence do the work. Then came the detail that hadn't existed before. Small. Almost careless. A correction offered without being asked for. Investigators exchanged glances they didn't hide. Corrections mean the original version is no longer sufficient. Corrections mean the truth is leaking. From there, the conversation shifted. Not toward confession, but toward containment. What exactly do you think we know? What do you think we can prove? These questions don't come from innocence. They come from assessment. From someone trying to measure damage. Elsewhere, analysts worked parallel lines. Financial stresses resurfaced, reframed not as motive but as pressure. Debts. Conflicts. A moment in 2007 where multiple stresses converged within a narrow window of time. Investigators stopped asking what someone would do under that pressure, and started asking what they didn't do afterward. No missing person report filed when it would have made sense. No follow-up calls. No visible panic. The search team received new direction. Not new land. New purpose. They revisited locations already searched, but this time with a focus on movement rather than concealment. Paths between places. Time required to travel unnoticed. Areas that offered temporary cover, not permanent burial. The theory evolved. This may never have been about hiding a body forever. It may have been about buying time. That theory unsettled everyone. Because buying time implies a second step. A later decision. Something that happened after the town stopped watching closely. A weather report from 2007 resurfaced. Heavy rain, days after the disappearance. Flooding in low areas. Soil displacement. Investigators noted it quietly. Nature can be an accomplice without knowing it. The media sensed blood in the water. Requests intensified. Rumors sharpened. Law enforcement tightened communication, aware that one misstep could collapse years of work. They had enough now to feel confident, but not enough to feel safe. The family was brought in again. Not for updates. For preparation. Investigators explained the realities ahead, delays, challenges, the possibility that charges might come without answers, or answers without charges. The family listened, faces set, grief long since hardened into endurance. They said something investigators wouldn't forget, even if the law never says it, we know what happened. Belief is powerful. But belief isn't a verdict. As Part 13 closed, the case stood at its most dangerous point, not because it was weak, but because it was strong and visible. People who had been comfortable in ambiguity now faced clarity approaching fast enough to frighten them. Someone was running out of time. And when time runs out, people make mistakes. Mistakes rarely arrive loudly. They slip in through routine, through confidence, through the belief that the worst has already passed. After 17 years, that belief had calcified. And that was the mistake. It started with a contradiction, so minor it almost escaped notice. A timeline adjustment offered casually, framed as clarification. But clarification only matters when the original version can no longer hold. Investigators flagged it immediately. Not because it proved anything, but because it narrowed the window. Narrow windows trap people. Follow-up interviews intensified. Not more aggressive. More precise. The same questions, asked in different order, at different times, by different voices. Stories don't unravel all at once. They fray. Edges soften. Seams show. And when pressure is applied consistently, even well-rehearsed narratives begin to collapse inward. One interview ended abruptly. Not in anger. In fear. The subject requested counsel mid-sentence, a pivot so sudden it altered the room's gravity. Investigators had seen this before. The moment when cooperation realizes it has gone too far. When someone senses they've crossed from helpful into exposed. That reaction mattered. Behind the scenes, prosecutors reviewed everything again, not with hope, but with caution. Strong cases don't need luck, but they do need discipline. Every